Hey everyone, and welcome back to our Bible study, Exodus chapter 16. Today, we are approaching the middle of the book. There's 40 chapters in Exodus, so 16 today. Let's jump in. When did these events happen? Well, we've mentioned several times now that Moses was born about 1571 BC, and the Exodus, or when the children of Israel received their freedom from slavery in Egypt, that occurred 80 years later, about 1491 BC. In terms of our main characters in this chapter, we have the Israelites. They're also known as the Hebrews. They were the descendants of Jacob's family, of his 12 sons that grew into a really large nation during the time that they were enslaved in Egypt. They're now going into the wilderness as they make their way to Canaan, the promised land. We have Moses, who is God's chosen representative to lead the Israelites. He grew up in the household of Pharaoh, royalty of Egypt. But then God used him to deliver the Israelites from Egypt. And then our last main character is Aaron. He is a Levite. He was the brother of Moses, and God had him help Moses as he was leading the Israelite nation. Looking at our map then, where did these events take place? Well, as we mentioned, we don't exactly know where the Israelites crossed the Red Sea and escaped the Egyptians for the final time. Somewhere along the Red Sea, where there was enough water to drown an army. That's about all that we know. God led the Hebrews from the Red Sea to a place called Marah, and then on to a place called Elam. Leaving Elam, they then went into the wilderness of Sin, S-I-N, which is between Elam and Sinai. And you can see those locations on the map. And I will mention that I am taking kind of the traditional route of the Exodus and portraying that in the maps. As I mentioned in the last video, there's a lot of debate about these locations and the exact route that the Israelites took out of Egypt. And so now let's move into our outline. Verses 1 through 3 of chapter 16, the Israelites grumble because they have no food. And so we're back to complaining. They were complaining about water in the last chapter, now they're complaining about food. A month after leaving Egypt, the people of Israel were wandering in the wilderness of Sin, and they were complaining that they didn't have any food. They told Moses that they would actually just rather go back to Egypt, where they at least had enough bread to eat. I guess they forgot how hard it was back in Egypt. That moves us into our second section, verses 4 through 31, the bulk of the chapter. God gives food and bread from heaven. So Moses warned the people that their complaining wasn't against him or against Aaron, but the people were guilty of complaining against God. God's glory appeared to Moses in the cloud, and he told Moses that he had heard the grumblings of the people and that he would send them meat at twilight, and then he would send them bread in the morning. So that evening, God sent quail into the camp, and the people ate them. I've never eaten a quail. I've heard they're good, but never had one myself. Apparently the people like them. In the morning, when the dew evaporated, a small, fine, flake-like bread appeared on the ground. And it was unlike any bread that the people had ever eaten. God instructed each family to go out and to gather enough bread for one day, just one day, no more, no less. But of course, there were people who didn't listen, and they tried to gather more than just one day's worth of bread and store it away. But the Bible tells us that the bread spoiled overnight and it bred worms. Disgusting. The only day that the people were told to gather extra was on the sixth day of the week, because God set the seventh day apart as a special day of rest. You remember talking about that, God's Sabbath day laws on every seventh day of the week. The people weren't supposed to do any work. And so they were going to gather extra on the sixth day for the seventh day so they could observe the Sabbath. The people called this mysterious bread manna or manna. And the Bible describes it, quote, "It was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey." So that sounds pretty good. God told Moses to preserve a small amount of this manna in a jar as a memorial of how God had fed the Hebrews during their time in the wilderness. The Hebrews ate the manna for the 40 years that they were wandering around in the wilderness. That's what we're going to be talking about in the next couple of chapters. And if you don't know why they have to wander around in the wilderness for such a long period of time, well, that question will be answered in the upcoming chapters. And so that is Exodus chapter 16. Let's close with an application. Many people are quick to characterize the God of the Old Testament, as they say, as this heartless, impatient judge who just loves punishing people. But the people who promote that portrayal of God, I would suggest, have probably never read or studied the entire Old Testament. They're probably cherry picking some verses and talking mostly from a place of ignorance. Notice God in this passage. Notice his patience in this passage. He delivered the Israelites from slavery with magnificent miracles. And how did they respond? Well, by constantly complaining after they had received their freedom. Yet, through their complaining, God was patient with them and even blessed them with some of the things that they requested of him. So I say that to say that when you're trying to figure out and learn about the God who is portrayed in the Bible, make sure to discover God's character through reading the scriptures, the authoritative source of how God acted. Don't depend on someone else to tell you who he is. There are a lot of so-called experts out there misrepresenting the character and the nature of God because they've never actually read the text. So that's why it's important to do Bible study for yourself and do studies like these to get a big picture of God and the way that he interacted with people all throughout time, and especially in the Jewish nation who he had called to be his people.